of Korea did not go well. Ill-equipped and outgunned, American soldiers were forced to use tanks as artillery pieces. The segregated American units, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, were engaged in grim defensive battles. The troops were often outnumbered by 3 and 4 to 1. 10 days after landing in Busan, African-American units were ordered to recapture the town of Yecheon. The 2-day battle was brutal.
I will remember Yecheon for another 100 years. Even in my nightmares, I've never seen carnage, death, and destruction to equal, even to approach that of 20 July 1950. Captain Charles Busey.
In the hills outside the city, Captain Busey and 3 Army truck drivers surprised a gathering of North Koreans who were preparing to ambush American troops. The ensuing machine gun battle left 258 enemy soldiers dead.
I was ashamed of the slaughter before me, but this was my job and my responsibility. I was a soldier, and gore was the hallmark of my trade. I was born to be on that hill that day. Destiny dictated it. I would like to have had a moment of shame, but there was no time, and there was no shame. Only duty. Captain Charles Busey.
For the first time in its history, the United States military was integrated. Some of the units were under the command of black officers.
My job was being a combat officer. The white soldiers had no hang-ups about being with me because they realized they had to follow me if they wanted to get out alive. Lieutenant Charles Armstrong.
One of the most intense artillery bombardments of the Korean War was directed at Hill 983. The soldiers called it Bloody Ridge, and Lieutenant Charles Armstrong was ordered to capture it.
When I told my men that we were going to take the hill that night, they cried. They told me that we were all dead. They said, look at what's happened to the other soldiers that have gone up there. I told them, that's not us. Napalm bombs, grenades, and mortars exploded all around us as we marched up that bloody barren hill. We stayed close together and didn't lose a single soldier. Lieutenant Charles Armstrong.
Shortly after Dwight Eisenhower assumed the presidency in 1953, the shooting stopped in Korea and started in Vietnam. A year later, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu fell to the communists, and in Washington, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Both events would shake the United States to its very core.
I would never fight on the foreign shore for America again. Black people should not be called on to assume the duties of citizenship where they don't enjoy the rights and privileges. A lot of black soldiers have been brainwashed. When they come back and they see what they fight for doesn't mean a thing, and they are still considered niggas, well, then, a lot of things are going to happen. It all depends on how much combat fatigue they have. Radio operator David Tuck.
As the fighting in Vietnam continued to intensify, so too did the demonstrations at home. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out.
We have been faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same school. Martin Luther King Jr.
As in wars past, the enemy couldn't understand why black soldiers would fight so valiantly for a country that mistreated them. The Viet Cong published a pamphlet which they distributed to American troops.
Afro-Americans, in the States, you are called niggers. The Vietnamese people are not your enemy. Your enemies are those who are carrying out harsh exploitation and extremely barbarous racial discrimination against American blacks, and have forced you to serve in the U.S. war of aggression against Vietnam and sow ruin and mourning for the Vietnamese people, your brothers. You cannot resign yourself to being forever second-class citizens in the United States and first-line cannon fodder in Vietnam.
As the world rang in the 21st century, a global millennium celebration seemed to provide people of all races, faiths, and traditions with hope for the future. Yet, in remote Middle Eastern hideouts, terrorists were plotting America's destruction. Back in 1998, suicide bombers had blown up the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Their next target was the USS Cole.
Hostility toward America is a religious duty, and we hope to be rewarded for it by God. Osama bin Laden.
Of the 17 sailors who lost their lives in the attack, 6 were African Americans, and 2 of those were women.
My heart ached as I thought of the families. Children who won't have a daddy home for Christmas. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, fiancés, and friends. All left behind as these 17 take their final tour of duty to a port we call heaven. Sailors, we salute you on your journey home. USS Cole Memorial website.
The story of America's black patriots is a paradox. Since 1641, there has never been a time in our history when African Americans were unwilling to serve and bravely sacrifice for their country. Yet, despite this valiant heritage, until recently, no matter the conflict, whenever America was engaged in war, the question, would the Negro fight, was raised in numerous ways, and always with the same racist assumptions. African Americans were inferior. They couldn't be trusted with a gun. They didn't have the intelligence or the courage to fight. They wouldn't follow orders, let alone ever be capable of giving them.
repeatedly demonstrated, what ultimately needed to be asked wasn't would the Negro fight, but rather why. As African American servicemen and women continue to shed their blood in the defense of the United States, the answer to that question is abundantly clear. Like all Americans in all wars, African Americans fought for love of liberty.
That's a condensed version of a 4-hour movie. I don't know if I've seen it, but it actually read 4 hours. But I thought it was pretty well put on, and I hope you all appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'll bring you up to how the point really got started. In the late 1930s, when Americans' involvement in the war that was raging in Europe seemed inevitable, and black and white men were being drafted to the armed forces, black men resented bitterly their exclusion from the nation's defense industries, government office, and combat-type military unit. For example, in New York City, there were over 30,000 defense workers, and of that number, only 200 were African Americans. And those few were limited to such jobs as janitors, sweepers, and elevator operators. In the military, segregation was the official government policy, which was a carryover from the Civil War. The Army and Navy accepted enlistments of African Americans, but the proud old United States Marine Corps refused to accept enlistments of African Americans. And African American newspapers were reporting race riots and Jim Crow conditions in many of the military bases and camps. The Baltimore Afro-American newspapers called for African Americans to desert rather than serve in military camps in the South. Leaders of major black organizations petitioned the government, the federal government, to meet this responsibility. A. Philip Randolph said on January the 1st, 1941, that the government would not act on behalf of Negroes until it saw 10, 20, 50,000 Negroes on a White House lawn. Leaders of all the major black organizations offered to join Randolph, and the March on Washington movement was formed. On June the 1st, 1941, it was announced that the March on Washington movement would rally 50,000 Negroes in Washington on July the 1st, 1941, to demand that the government take action. The idea of an African-American rebellion at the time of crisis to Washington's panic. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the march leaders to Washington and tried to persuade them to call the march off. They refused. Consequently, on June the 25th, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order number 8082, the Fair Employment Practice Act, which banned discrimination, defense plans, government office, and the armed forces. This order required the Marine Corps to change its racial policy, but the Marine Corps was determined to remain a white male institution. The Commandant said that Negroes had no place in the units he commanded, and that if the Negro race was trying to break into the organization where it wasn't wanted, and that if the Negroes really wanted to serve their country, they had every opportunity to do so in the Army. Consequently, the Secretary of the Navy directed the Marine Corps to begin enlisting African Americans. So the Marine Corps started on June the 1st, 1942, to enlist African Americans. Their initial quota was only 900 recruits, 200 each from the eastern and central parts of the country and 500 from the south. However, throughout the war, a total of 19,168 African Americans were recruited from all over the nation, shipped off to Munford Point, New River, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, for separate but equal recruit training. There's no doubt about it, anyone's mind about the training being separate, but by the stretch of no one's imagination was it equal. Throughout the war, all of the commissioned officers were white. And initially, all the drill instructors were white NCOs. But as fast as African American NCOs could be trained, they replaced the white NCOs. I'm trying to cut And throughout the war, a total of 51 depot companies and 12 ammunition companies were formed. Some of these companies served as sure part of labor and worked as black points and forward field depots. Some made combat landings and served as infantrymen. 2 defense battalions were formed, the 51st and 52nd. Both of these defense battalions were deployed overseas, but neither saw combat. After the war ended, a total of 5 field depot companies and 1 ammunition company were included in the Presidential Unit Citation for their combat role on Saipan and Tinian Islands. And 2 black companies were awarded the Navy Unit Commendation as part of the 1st Representative Marine Brigade. Of the 63 ammunition depot companies, 24 saw combat and suffered nearly 100 combat casualties. Munford Point provided recruit training and housing for African American recruits from August 1942 to September 1949. After the war ended, on November the 10th, Frederick C. Branch was the first African American to be commissioned in the Marine Corps. He was commissioned as second lieutenant on November 10th, 1945. And then on July the 26th, 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, which banned color bias in the armed services, and consequently Munford Point Camp was deactivated. And then in August 1974, Munford Point Camp was redesignated to Camp Gilbert H. Johnson after Hashmark Johnson and the Munford Point Marine. I'll stop here, and if you've got something you want to say, I'll let you say it, and then I'll come back and answer questions. You guys say anything? Okay. Well, we'll entertain questions now. Then, if you have any questions, or I can go into more detail. I can tell you about my personal experience, and I can do that. If you don't have any questions, or how's that time running? Yes, sir.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Well, thank you for your service.
Thank you.
My dad was a Marine. He was a drill sergeant, actually.
Oh, great.
I couldn't get nowhere near the Marines.
Oh, sorry about that.
I went Air Force. I wanted to stay home and play video games. As a Munford Point Marine, and in this historic time that we've just seen, both in 2008 and last Tuesday, or actually twice elected African American as president, how does your generation view the African American youth today? Does anything stand out about the direction you see, especially for young black males? Do you see anything? What would you tell a young black man if he's good today? What would be the one thing you would tell him to help him out?
Well, I would certainly tell him to get his education. That's the first thing. Once he's got his education, there are plenty of opportunities. And right now, if President Obama is now president, and I don't think he's going to be that interested to get the country back in the war like I assume Mitt Romney would have done, I would then suggest that the young Americans consider, male and female, consider the services. It's an excellent opportunity to get started. You get your education there, and come out prepared to do a lot of things that you won't be able to do if you try to do it on your own. So unless your parents got a lot of money to send you to colleges, you can have problems. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
My question deals with the people who are not in the military at Munford Point, but the civilians, particularly the black community in the area outside the gate. How did they receive you as the first black Marines showing up down there in North Carolina? Was that a refuge, or were they just?
The Camp Guns, Camp Lejeune, that's where we were part of, was a large base, about 200 square miles. The city of Jacksonville was only about 4 square blocks, which had the white there. That was the railroad track, and across the railroad track, maybe there were a dozen black families, but there weren't that many, and there were thousands of us. So you can imagine how that would have turned out when you got 1,000 black Marines, male Marines, and about half a dozen families that maybe had 2 or 3 daughters there. So it created a lot of problems. So what happened then? We tried to get out to various other cities like Rocky Mount, Wilson, and whatnot. But the problem, we had a big problem because Camp Lejeune was a big base, and they had thousands and thousands of white Marines at Camp Lejeune, main side. And like I say, total, we altogether we only had 19,000. But at one time, I don't think we had more than 1,000 or 500 black Marines on the base. So, but what the problem was created that when we wanted to get away from Jacksonville, because as I said, it was such a small place, we had problems getting out of Jacksonville because when you took off on Friday to leave, you had Camp Lejeune, which had thousands of white Marines coming out to catch the bus. Well, because of Jim Crow law, whites could board the bus first, and we had to wait till all the whites had gotten on. So what that meant was the bus would get filled with white, take off. We start off 4:30. For example, one of my experiences, I left my base at 4:30, my office at 4:30, and went to Jacksonville to catch the bus to go into Rocky Mount because I was coming to Washington. I got in Jacksonville around 4:30, a little after. The bus probably pulled out right about 6 p.m. to pick up people out of Jacksonville. So by the time all the whites got on there, we couldn't get on. So at 8 o'clock, another bus comes in. We still got the same problem. We still got a lot of whites still trying to get out of there too. So that bus pulls out. So it was midnight before I was able to get on a bus to go to Rocky Mount. So when I got to Rocky Mount, I got trained. And of course, catching the train was a problem because we had Fort Bragg was south of us. So the train came to Fort Bragg and then came to Rocky Mount. So we had a problem there. So what we learned to do was when the train pulls out, because they had MPs, and MPs would control everything. So when the train pulls out, before the train pulled out, we'd walk down the track because we knew that the conductor on the train would have to lay a platform over the steps and then close the door. This is back in the 40s and 50s, so you might not be familiar with the trains that way, but that's the way the trains were. Of course, they were cold. They were powered by coal. Anyway, when the train starts pulling out, and the conductor lays this platform over the steps, what we would do is run and toss our bag at him, which made him move back so we could jump on that platform. And that's how we got out. Because there was only one coach, and that was for blacks. So if you didn't get on that one coach, you had a problem. So that's how we got out of there. And we tried riding buses, but that was so uncomfortable. Because in the South, like I say, we were faced with Jim Crow laws in the South. The bus would stop at a restaurant, but if you're black, you had to go around the back to be served. And then if you wanted to use the restroom, they had an outhouse for you, which they didn't clean. Nobody ever cleaned it. So you can imagine what that was like. So we wouldn't ride the bus. We'd always ride the train because it was just nicer. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, in your bio, it said that you came in, enlisted, got out, got your degree, and then came back. So it's actually a two-part question. One, what made you come back after you had your master's degree? And then, your bachelor's degree. And then two, what was the difference in your experience from the enlisted side to come back as a commissioned officer?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. When the war ended, the war had ended. I didn't go overseas during the war. So I had graduated because it was a high school at the time, which was administrative school, and I had learned to type, so I could type. So when I finished boot camp, the first thing they pulled me out, stuck me in the company office as a typist, and I then became chief clerk. So when the war ended, I was in Norfolk. I was sent to Norfolk with a depot that was detached from Norfolk Point. Then the war would end, so they began to bring the military back from overseas, but they had to send replacements. And since I hadn't been overseas, I was eligible to be a replacement to go over, but everybody was coming home, so I didn't want that at all. So fortunately for me, being a chief clerk, the commandant came up with a letter that says, if you can type and willing to work at headquarters Marine Corps, submit a letter. Well, I knew not to send it through Camp Lejeune because they would have pulled it out, because like I said, I had gone overseas and they needed replacements. So what I did, I sent my letter to the admiral of the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. I guess it was there, I've forgotten that so long ago. But whoever he was, I sent my letter to him, via him to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, because you can't go straight to the Commandant. So being in administration, I knew how to get around these things. So anyway, I did that, so I got up to headquarters Marine Corps. Well, before I went up there, I'd like to say too, that while I was in Norfolk, our quarters were placed next to the Italian prisoners, and they had more liberty in Norfolk than we did. They could ride anywhere on the bus. We had to ride on the back. They could go anywhere they wanted to go in Norfolk. We had to go to the colored section, which we get kind of irritated a little bit. So anyway, getting back, I sent my letter to headquarters Marine Corps. Fortunately, the commandant sent a letter back to me and says, you're ordered to come to headquarters Marine Corps. So that meant that then Camp Lejeune couldn't do anything because the commandant says, come to the Marine Corps, come to headquarters.